Thank you, Aubrey, and your passion comes through very strongly. And I think we've heard many testimonies from lived experience, testimonies from people who are in addiction or have been through addiction or in recovery. And I think what you do share there, Aubrey, is the essence of hope. And there is hope for everybody at all different stages. So that's good and reassuring for all of us today as well. And can I just say to panellists, thanks again for holding the time. You will have an opportunity in the Q&A if you want to go back to a point that you didn't have enough time in your presentation, or you want to stress something you didn't have the time to say. So there'll be plenty more time. I'm actually going to go straight to the tables again. That's the format we have for this. Sorry, straight to the Q&A this time, just in terms of anybody's. A lot of the teams I think that we did here in this morning's session do flow through from yesterday's teams, particularly from Father Peter McVerry and others yesterday, just sharing some of the issues around a holistic approach to supports for people in terms of prevention. You can't just tackle the addiction issue. You've tackled many of the other environmental issues, which the panellists again have outlined, and indeed Laura outlined again. So I'm going to open it out, open mic, again random. Anybody want to just put up their hand, and we'll have a mic for if you want to pose any questions for the panel, please. Jessie, table 7.
Thanks. This is for Pat Dolan. I'm just asking about the new Activate Social Empathy that you're putting into the SPHE modules and stuff like that within the schools. We heard yesterday that SPHE is actually only compulsory for the first 3 years. So how are you tailoring that to the right age group, and should you not be looking forward to maybe the transition 5th and 6th years?
Pat, just before you take time, I'm just going to take another question and keep them flowing, and then, yeah, sorry, back at, I can't see tables. If you can put your table numbers up, I'll be able to. All right, 12, sorry, I'm too small.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Great session, guys. Andy and Sean, can you just elaborate a little bit on your success rate and how you measure your success for NA? It seems a worthwhile project. Just like to know a little more about the success of it. Thank you.
And sorry, if there's one more people, yeah, back at table 2 here.
Good morning, thank you. Thank the panel for a very interesting presentation. I have a very quick question for Aubrey. I just wondered about the cost, how much it costs to put an individual through your programme in Tiglin, including the wraparound care and the accommodation services.
Thank you. Okay, 3 very clear questions, and again, I'll ask other panellists to come in as well. But firstly, Pat, the empathy and the SPHE programme and timeframes.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. The short answer is the programme in the SPHE programme is only coming in now. It's based on 10 years of research to get it to this point. And I must acknowledge Annette Honan in particular in the curriculum unit for their support. We're actually designing it also for transition year as well, because transition year students, the curriculum is under review at the moment. There's a new transition year curriculum coming out. What young people will receive in the early part of the programme in first year, second year of SPHE is 4 core lessons, and then there's the full programme in the senior cycle. And it covers 4 core areas: understanding what empathy is, barriers to empathy or being empathic in your own life, what's stopping you from showing compassion to others, practicing it then with other people in the class through exercises, and then you do an act of social good in your community. So you actually get, now the fuller programme, which is a 12 lesson programme, we have that through Feroga, we have that in community youth work organisations as well, but it's a matter of getting this in stages. I mean, if I was Minister for Education, I'd have it compulsory everywhere fully tomorrow. But I have to say, in fairness to Annette and colleagues at the Department of Education, they have been very, very supportive. And just to finally add that it's based on evidence. It's not. We've done a lot of research on this in terms of trialling it, and what we're finding already is that it actually is quite amazingly liberating from young people. We actually have young people. We train them as researchers. They actually trained as researchers with us in the university, and they actually have evaluated the programme on the basis of what they think really works. And it's really, really been quite alarmingly refreshing for me.
And Pat, we had Annette was here with us yesterday
Oh,
as
was
well
she?
as part of that. Yeah, just to say
Okay.
that. But can I just ask, just to follow on very briefly, there was a number of questions from the members yesterday about the delivery of the programme in the SPHE,
Yeah.
and Annette was saying best delivered by teachers, and that was a strong view. Have you any view on that? I mean, could individuals who's been through different experiences add value into the schools?
Absolutely. But one of the things we've developed as part of the programme is with youth as researchers, actually with Cillian Murphy, the actor who's patron of the project, we have young people who've looked at social issues in their life, including issues around drug use, issues around mental health, issues around LGBTQ plus issues, things that were going on in their life. And they've researched those, made short videos on the evidence of their finding, and we're using that as a peer learning through 6-7 minute YouTube videos. But within the schools, there's obviously much more space within community youth work programs about how it's delivered in schools because of tight schedules. The main thing is that it's actually from my perspective anyway, the main thing is that it is now in the system and hopefully will grow from there.
No, thanks, and thanks for coming back on that. I think, Andy, Sean, there was the question around measuring success, which would come up again yesterday consistently, and just, Laura, I might come to you then after as well. Just, I mean, how do you measure success as well, also from some of the programmes? So, Andy, Sean?
Yeah, as is the nature of our organisation, we do not keep membership records. So the only data that we actually generate is self-reported responses to the survey, which we referenced earlier, that last survey in 2018, which was taken at the World Convention. And we've left some leaflets on the tables as well, which have a European version of that survey. The self-reported median time of being clean from all mood-altering substances from that survey in 2018 was 11.4 years. So I'm afraid that's all we can offer, really.
No.
Just by the nature of the organisation, you know, we don't take properly scientific surveys because the construction of the organisation precludes it.
No, and look, I think all organisations, the members were asking this question of all providers, service providers, and I understand it's difficult, and what's the measure of success when, you know, it's human issues we're dealing with. Laura, do you want to add anything? Sorry.
Yeah, I suppose in the summertime we did an art competition for children across Ireland living in kinship care. And one submission we had back was a poem written by an 11-year-old in the kinship care of her auntie. I don't have it in front of me, but I know it off by heart. And she wrote, "Lost and alone." And the words she wrote were, "Through no fault of my own, I was lost and alone. I didn't know what to do and had no place to call home. To my delight, my auntie shone a light and guided me into their life. I found happiness and love and a bedroom of my own in my happy ever after home, no longer alone." When we talk about prevention and early intervention, that child's worldview, her sense of self-esteem, her connection and her worth within her family unit, being cared for by her extended family when she couldn't be cared for by her parents, that's our measure of success. And I could go into the quantitative, but the qualitative always hits the heart.
And I'm going to come back to our other panellists in a second, but I know, and she would never forgive me now, but I know Johanna Ivers has some research here on Peer Led. Are you awake there, Johanna? Sorry.
So I know I accept the limitations of the membership of the fellowship and absolutely respect it, but I think it would be remiss not to mention the emerging strong science around the cost effectiveness of fellowship, including NA and AA. So there's some papers that I'm pulling together to put on the members' site just to look at, I suppose, the cost savings that come from that. So when we talk about what are the measures of success for fellowship, predominantly they're quite interested in abstinence, but what the literature is finding is that it has a direct effect on quality of life, connection with community, and all the things that we refer to collectively as recovery capital. And then, so that's staunch work coming from John Kelly in Harvard Medical School and Keith Humphreys in Stanford and other colleagues. Keith is also developing a strong science around Oxford housing. So what is it like when we support people in recovery housing? So again, I'm pulling this together because I kind of preempted your question, and I'll put it up on the members. But I think it would be remiss not to talk about the fact that fellowship has been one of probably the best kept secrets in recovery, for all of the reasons that the two guys talked about, respecting that level of confidentiality, but ultimately we're sitting on really good outcome measures as well. So I will share that. Thank you.
That's very helpful.
Could
That's very helpful, Johanna, and I promise that's the last time I'll sporadically call on you. Not. Sorry.
And just to follow on, thank you very much for that, Joanna. One of our slides taken at this informal, and again we can provide copies of this afterwards if needs be, is areas of improvement, which was self-reported at the World Convention. 91% of respondents had an improvement in family relationships, 87% had an improvement in social connectedness, 79% had an improvement in hobbies and interests, 76% improvement in stable housing, 78% improvement in employment, and 55% an improvement in education advancement. Thank you.
Thank you. And Aubrey, I know it's actually on a similar kind of vein, the question posed yourself, so feel free to talk about this, the effectiveness.
The cost. With Tiglin, we have a residential program. We also do community sobriety as well. But the residential program is in-house. We have a men's centre and a women's centre. And the cost per person is roughly about 35,000, including aftercare. But the cost it's a 16-month program. So that includes the aftercare. So when you work it out over that period. One thing I have found when I set up Tiglin, I mean, I was stupid enough to get a mortgage from AIB of 110%. So literally, we had no idea what we were doing. And if we knew what we were doing, we probably wouldn't have done it. But what has happened in the meantime, we realised we've had to be creative in how we fund. So that's why the social enterprises, they have been phenomenal. So not only have they brought people back into the community and given them a good job, it's also brought in income. So we've subsidised a lot. So perhaps if you work that out, they're not real figures, but that's the cost. We are supported by task forces, we're supported by the HSE, and we work with whatever funds. So if you have a few quid, we'd certainly take it off you. Thank you.
Oh, they have lots of money, trust me. Yeah, okay, I'm going to go back to the floor again, and I'll take 2 or 3 questions again. And I see table 1, and then table 3, and table 14.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentations. On previous meetings, one thing that struck us all, I think, is the amount of people that are active in the voluntary sector. And I just wanted to ask, in a general sense, I think there are 280 charities in the drug areas in Ireland. What's your view on that? And what's your view on, while it's run by very well-meaning, motivated individuals and organisations, is it not more a civil right that it should be provided by the state in some way, while not obviously taken away from all the people that are trying to do the right things in their communities and organisations?
I'll come back to that in a second. Table 3, I think, wasn't it?
Thank you. Hello. A couple of people there mentioned employment and getting work for some of the recovered people. Is that a natural step? Are there many groups assisting in getting employment for recovered addicts?
Thank you. Very clear question as well. I will come back to table 10 in a minute, but table 14 first of all, and then I'll take table 10 after that.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to ask Laura in relation to the kinship care and funding for that programme. We had a wonderful grandmother present to us earlier in one of our assemblies, and one of the things she said was that they get no money. And what's your recommendation to us of what we could do to help you in that area? Thank you.
Thank you. Very clear. And just because the hand is up, table 10, I'll take Jack.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask Professor Pat Dolan, what is meant, or could you please elaborate on empathetic education and why you think it possesses untapped potential?
Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, the first question, just if I can come to it, which has been on the members' minds on a few occasions, and I know we have Jim Walsh presenting from the department later, but question around the number of community and voluntary organisations working in this very challenging area, and should this be a rights-based approach, and should it be statutory services provided by the state, or is this the right model, or what would you see as the right model? So, Aubrey, I might go to you first.
Yeah, you know, I'm in business myself, and I'm a volunteer for Tiglin, and I've never taken any contributions or anything from Tiglin. And the reason I got involved, as a child, I had seen addiction firsthand. I remember getting on my bike and I cycled into Naas. I had found out there's an alcohol worker with the HSE, and I went to meet them. And basically, they sat me down and they said, there's nothing they can do, basically. Now, a lot has changed since, and I know that. But I would far prefer to be devoting my time to my business and different interests. But I realised that with families in addiction, somebody needs to do something. And when nobody's shouting, even a whisper gets heard. So that's why I set up Tiglin. And I absolutely agree with you. I think we shouldn't have to set up Tiglin. I think it should be done by the state. But in the meantime, we have to be doing something, because as Laura said, there's people falling in and we're trying to pull them out of the river. So the answer to your question is yes, the state should do it. But in the meantime, organisations such as Tiglin and many other fantastic organisations are the ones on the ground that are doing it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, thanks. And I think it is recognised the huge gap that the voluntary community sector is organised. And I think the question more comes from, you know, should state take the obligation, take a bigger role? I think it's...
And Paul, just my personality is, if I see a gap, when we set up Tiglin, then we saw a gap. When the guys were coming out of it, they were going back to the very place they got ill in the first place. So we said, okay, housing is an issue there. So we had to provide supported housing. There's a gap. Then we found a lot of them had no CV. What are you going to do? Say I was in rehab for 6 months? So nobody's going to employ you. So we decided then there's an educational gap, there's an employment gap. So we've been filling gaps, and I think that's what we're good at. But in the meantime, I would hope that the state certainly would come on board more so.
Laura, can I just ask you to comment on that question, but also not just that question there about the role of the state versus the role of community voluntary, but also then the question around funding sources and any recommendations you feel you should like to make to us, the Assembly members?
Yeah, I think in relation to your question here, Table 1, there's so many services in some communities, they're so dense with services, and we're trying to get that collaboration and that joined up thinking, for want of a better expression, so that there's not that duplication, that services are working together to make sure that there's accessibility to all types of services within the community. I do agree with you, though, that it should be streamlined access to services, dual diagnosis, different pathways, the creation of beds and facilities that are accessible. I don't know if that answers your question either, but it is that piece. I'm really glad that you asked that question at Table 14. Kinship care is often an alternative to more formal foster or state care, and kinship carers are entrusted with the full-time care of a child. But at that critical time when they take on that role, that family are closed off to social work intervention, and we would be advocating for a support pathway at that time. That's why we were in the Oireachtas on Wednesday. We have been engaging with Minister O'Gorman's department around that policy development. Families require an access to financial, legal, trauma recovery support and other interventions. To give context, there's an estimated 10,000 children in kinship care in Ireland. Last year, just over 2,000 payments of the Guardian's payment were made out, and that's the only accessible social welfare payment that kinship carers can apply for. Many kinship carers are grandparents, as you said, funding that full-time caring role on their state pension. I spoke with a kinship carer recently in her 70s. She advised she wasn't afforded the dignity to make funeral repayments for her son because she was struggling to make ends meet and put food at the table and meet the basic needs of the children who were left in her care as a result of that parental loss. Families are being pushed into poverty. They need to be scaffolded and supported at that time, but they're actually being pushed down and met with closed doors. That's one area that we're advocating for. There's also many, many more, but I hope that answers your question, and we are advocating for reform of the Guardian's payment along with an increase of the payment. It's €203 per week in stark contrast to the foster carers payment, which is €325 per week with an increment when the child turns the age of 12, in recognition that raising a child of an older age is more expensive. So those families need to be supported to fulfil that role, and thank you for that question.
It's a very clear recommendation. That's what you see can add some value and help. Can I just ask again, Andy and Sean, do you want to make any comment on this question and challenge around the role of the state versus the role of voluntary organisations or community organisations?
With the greatest of respect to the Assembly, this is not something that we can have any comment on. We don't have an opinion on government policy or anything other than what we do. What we're concerned with is directly helping addicts helping addicts, and anything else we don't venture an opinion on.
No, fair enough. You did say at the start, and didn't want to put you on the spot. Pat, I know you're trying to come in there.
Yeah, just on that question, because I think it's a really important question, and I think I'd say three things. One is that absolutely, that was my opening statement. I think there is a moral case on the state to invest. It doesn't mean that they exclude community and voluntary organisations. I think they need to work in partnership with them. It's the vehicle, but they have to be funded properly. They have to be given the capacity to do what they can do, and they're not being given that. That's been straight. The second point I make is that there's also an argument apart from services to think, you know, in UNICEF globally, in UNICEF internationally and the UN, they're looking at the idea of cash transfers, that actually giving people physically what they need is so important to actually, you know, in terms of literally giving them what they need to survive physically is something that we need to think about as an investment, you know, as a state investment. And the third one is a very basic one. If we know, and I know from my work and from my practice, when I worked in practice, and from listening to people here beside me, we know what works. We have the ingredients for the recipe. Why are we not using them? That, you know, and why is the state, you know, the state has to take leadership and not just deal with this in crisis mode. It's, you know, it's what Laura was saying. We have to pull it back and we have to invest. And the economic argument, if nothing else, the return on investment case is very, very strong, that actually it will save money over time.
Well done, Pat. And Pat, I'll come back to you in a minute, just in terms of Jack's question there at the end. I'll come back to you. Aubrey, can I just ask you to do one around employment and recovery assistance in terms of getting people to work? Or
do many organisations do that? I know there are a few NGOs that do. I know with Tiglin, we try to make sure that residents, they pursue education, they pursue apprenticeships, or if they're not interested in that, we found there was a cohort that were becoming a little bit unsure themselves. So therefore we set up one social enterprise in Greystones called Rise at the Cove. And it was I was sort of saying, oh, if it breaks even, we'll be lucky, but let's get people out to work. Now it has become, it won Social Enterprise of the Year award. It really is an example of what you can do in the community. And not only that, our guys and women who are trained in there as baristas and bakers, etc., they're now being poached by other cafes in the community. The other cafes think they're getting one over on us, but that's the best result ever. So our guys, what we're doing is something that works on the ground. We're doing the exact same in the city centre. We have a new cafe called All Rise as well. Sounds like an advertisement for my cafes, but I'm telling you, they actually work for people in recovery, and it makes a difference. So I think employment opportunities, community engagement is vital.
Yeah. All Rise. Okay. Pat, can I come back to Jack's question around empathetic education? And sorry, I'm sure you can't.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. The reason I was saying that it's untapped, I think it's something that, you know, is emerging. There's a lot of evidence emerging that in terms of what enables people to be resilient in their life is the compassion of others and their own self-compassion, actually. And I really think that we all need to be educated around this space, not just young people, but as a civic society. And the reason that it's really important is because it gets us to go from passive empathy, which is caring, to active empathy, which is doing something about it. And if we think about that as an entity in the context of drug use or in the context of any area of our life, it's really, really powerful. And what I really like, for example, in the Feroga National Programme around youth leadership, one of the things we measured was empathy. And what we found was that young people, if you do an act of kindness for somebody else, and this may seem very kind of like the Brady Bunch or the Waltons, I'm really serious. If you do good things for other people, your own self-esteem improves, they benefit. And if you think about that as a community entity, across services, across interventions in families, across people who are struggling because they don't have a sense of belonging, it is really powerful. And the untapped bit is to get it into our consciousness and into our education system.
Thanks, Pat. And many young people in our audience are looking glazed when you mentioned the Brady Bunch and the Waltons,
Yeah.
so they've no idea what we're talking about.
What would the modern version of that be?
Oh, I don't know. Sorry, I know Professor Amy Keenan might want to, Professor Amy Keenan might want to come in on the issue of the role of parental in terms of education and supports, parental supports.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks for calling. Just want to pay tribute to the fellowship. I suppose many years of treatment that we've been seeing people, caring for people, that we always direct people towards the fellowship on discharge from our care, because while we recognise that the state can provide supports in terms of addiction counselling in the community, the fellowship provides real support for people in recovery, and just to pay tribute to the two guys today. And I suppose we've been, the question about the NGO sector and the state providing all the care, I think if I suggested that we get rid of the NGO sector, I'd be shot in relation to that. So I think we do work in partnership, and I think a lot of the services in the community have grown from the community, and I think that we've got to remember in 1996 when Pat Rabbitt first introduced the task force model, it was grassroots from the community that were asking for involvement in responding to the problem which was affecting the community. So our partnership with the NGO sector, our partnership with communities is about, that's all about the work that we're doing in partnership, so that's important. But one specific issue I wanted to talk about was what Mary brought up yesterday, and she asked about experts coming into schools to talk to kids. And the idea was that the SPHE should be delivered within the schools by the teachers, and experts coming in is maybe counterproductive. But there is one area, I think, that maybe it's been neglected a little bit, about experts coming in and talking to parents parents of the children within the school, because I think we've maybe missed it a little bit, but parents have a hugely important role to play in relation to prevention with their children. And like it or not, parents are still a huge influence on children. We've heard about peers, we've heard about schools, but parents are the primary influence in terms of prevention. But parents often feel de-skilled when it comes to drugs. So they don't know about the drugs. The children will say to them, oh, look, you're drinking, you don't know anything about the new drugs. So parents often feel de-skilled and not ready to be able to talk to them. I think we should be coming in and providing webinars, which we do for parents, but information to parents in schools to enable them to be able to talk to the children, to do that primary prevention work at home and to do that upstream work at home. And I think that would be really beneficial as a recommendation from the community to empower parents in relation to this.
Thank you, Aaron. Okay, we still have time if there's one or two pressing questions. Thank you. 10. And if there's anyone else, can you just pop your hand up and I'll come to you after this.
Thank you. This is a question for Pat Dolan. You mentioned, Pat, at the end of your presentation that 20% of our national budget must be invested in social investment. Where did you come up with the figure of 20%? And do you know how much is being invested at the moment? Though I'm being very cynical, I suggest government would look at that as public spending, and they don't see it at the moment as an investment. So sorry, to go back to my question, you quoted a figure of 20% that needs to be invested. Where did you come up with that figure, and how much is being currently invested by government? Thank you.
Thank you, and a good question. Table 2, sorry for our Roman micers, please. It's just, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks, Paul, and thanks to the panel for their contribution this morning. Just a question to Pat. In your opening remarks, you were talking about in dealing with people with addiction. You used the word empathy, but you also used the word that caught my imagination, and it's the word not softness. Could you elaborate on that?
Just repeat it again, sorry.
You used the word empathy, but you also used the word not softness.
Yeah.
So I just concerned, for my own mind, you know, when you're dealing with people in that situation, how far can you go with somebody? Are you walking a very thin line? What is the line? The danger of overcrossing that line? And just another one, Paddy, if I may, just to Sean, brilliant work, both men, well done. Just a small issue, when you were giving your opening line, you used the word clean time. To me, that's a stigma. I would rather the word drug-free, to me, would sound a lot better, like we call people junkies. And I just think clean time means clean, it means you're unclean, there's something wrong, and it stigmatises people. I think, Pat, even to great work, and well done for what you're doing. Thank you.
No, very well put. Yeah. Thank you. Just one more here on table 4, and then we'll have to go to the panel.
It's a question for Aubrey McCarthy. Sorry. Which area of Ireland tingling covers, and what would it take to replicate the business model of tingling across Ireland? And could you please break down the cost of care? You mentioned 35,000 or across 16 months. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you again. Some really good questions posed. So, Pat, I might go to you first on the 20% social care investment. Where are we at? Where do you think we're at now? Where should it be?
Yeah, so the figure, the estimated 20% comes from the work of Jim Heckman from the University of Chicago, who very famously, he got a Nobel Prize, I think in 1990 for it. He did this amazing work looking at early childhood education, preschool, and he worked out for every dollar you spend in the first 5 years of life, the return to the state, the return to civic society was around 10. But he said, in order to, his work, and there's others have looked at this as well, they reckon that you need to put, of your budget, you need to think about 20% of your budget going into prevention, into early intervention services, rather than just going into acute, the acute end of the scale. They're saying a minimum of 20%. In terms of what is provided at the moment, I think, and Paul, you might remember this, under the wave of Atlantic philanthropies, when that whole movement came in the noughties and into the tens, there was a really strong investment in prevention and intervention overall in the Irish government. I think that has waned a bit, and we had, of course, the crash and all the various other things. I would say it's very low, to be honest, and I can't give you a figure. I don't know. There's no point in saying I know when I don't. Yeah.
And we will try to get some detailed figures on that, because it's a very good question. Pat, can I just stick with you, and then I might just also go to Laura before I go to Sean and Pat, but just the issue of words and importance of it, and stigmatisation, and potential stigmatisation, and just your experience in that.
Yeah. So I don't know if I used the word softness. I didn't mean to use the word softness. I meant it's not a soft issue. It shouldn't be seen as, empathy is sometimes seen as, well, it's not really important. My point is that it's a really important concept. I think that's what I meant. And the idea of empathy is that getting back to how far do you go, it's the capacity to be in the other person's shoes. It's the capacity to understand where they're going from. Effective empathy is that you can feel for them. And that really, to me, is the key. And I think that's the key ingredient why it's so important.
No, well point. And Laura, do you want to make any comment on that, just from what you say in your own experience and words and stigmatisation and marginalisation?
Yeah, I think at the moment in Ireland, the gap is widening in terms of that divide, I suppose. You talk about working in, banking or any of that, where you get increments and bonuses every 6 months, and there's a beer at the desk on a Friday when you meet your targets. That gap between empathy for communities that you might not be exposed to or aware of is widened because of that. And I think it breaks away then from that mindset of empathy, and the language that we use is so important. And focusing on parental empowerment is really important. And I know what I spoke about today is more focused on the extended family, because we only have 10 minutes, but you're absolutely right. The language that we use in terms of empowering and that hope that Aubrey was talking about, it's essential. The investment of creating opportunities and choice, but the language around that is so important. What the words we use, they stick, and they have a huge lasting impact.
No. and I'll come to Aubrey in a second, but just go back to, again, either Sean or Andy, just around the words and being clean, free.
Yeah, just as the name Narcotics Anonymous is something that if we were able to change it, we probably would. We are by definition creatures of habit. So once something kind of takes hold, it tends to say, and from my understanding, I was involved in the creation of a book about public relations, doing public relations on behalf of Narcotics Anonymous a number of years ago, and the term clean came as an alternative to the term sober, which was, I think, an effort to differentiate ourselves from Alcoholics Anonymous at a time when we were still a very fledgling organisation. Whilst we accept that words such as narcotics and clean can give a misleading impression of what actually happens at an NA meeting, if anybody comes to an NA meeting, and you were all able to come to NA meetings because we run regularly on a weekly basis, we run open public meetings where anybody who's interested in the Narcotics Anonymous program can come and experience what it is like to sit in an NA meeting. And NA meetings are filled with empathy. This is how it works. Certainly speaking for myself, you know, when I went to my very first meeting out in Dunleary in 1987, I was shocked, stunned, and greatly relieved to discover that I was not the only person who thought like this and had these fears and had done these things in my past. So it can't be understated just how much empathy is part of the process that happens with recovering addicts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. A very, very fair and clear answer. Aubrey, can I come back then? The question posed was what areas are covered, what would be cost of be replicating the model, any breakdown on the cost of care?
Okay, just before I answer that, I've just listened to Laura, just back about the hope. The hope for the individual is key for people in recovery. Recently, Lady Gaga was interviewed, and it's more modern than the Brady family, just that the younger people would understand. But when she did the Star is Born film, and she was interviewed, and she had come from abuse, and there was horrible addiction, a horrible chaos in her background. And she said she was in a room of 100 people, and one person there believed in her, and it made all the difference. And that's what we try to do with Tiglin, with kinship people. It's to try and see where the people that care, we actually invest in the individual, and the individual knows that the care is authentic, and that makes all the difference. So that's huge hope in recovery. Back to your point about where does Tiglin cover? Tiglin, I mean, when we bought the National Mountaineering Centre in 2008, and it was called Tiglin. So now we've 7 Tiglins, and the reason we called it Tiglin is because it was the sign on the gate, and so there was no trying to conquer the world. So could this be done nationwide? Absolutely. It doesn't necessarily have to be Tiglin. If somebody came along and said, Aubrey, we can do this better than you, I'd hand them the keys, because we're doing it because we know it makes a difference, but maybe there'll be a better model that comes along down the line. At the moment, we've a men's centre in Ashford in Wicklow, we've a women's centre in British Bay, we've transitional housing for men in Greystones, another one for women in Greystones, and then we've Dublin City Centre, and we've opened a new facility for younger people in Naas, 18 to 24, and so they're the areas we cover. President Higgins, when he was down with us, he said this should be replicated throughout the nation. And I think it's an easy model to replicate. And the business model, all of the models we do, there is absolutely no magical formula. We have fantastic staff who are committed. And I often find, there was a question from you earlier, why do NGOs do this? I'm an auctioneer by profession. And I was doing an auction recently at the Cancer Trials Ball. And they raised a fortune. And the reason everybody in the room was so dedicated to this is because they had experienced cancer in their own lives. So I think people like myself who have seen the wrong side of addiction can make a difference. So like Eamon said down the back, if you work with the state, perhaps the NGOs and the state can make a blasted difference in a big way. The cost-wise, roughly the 25 grand for the care part, 10 grand for the aftercare. That is full-time residential, 7 days a week. It works out roughly about €450 per individual. So it's good bang for buck.
Well done. Okay, we've reached a natural point where I need to let you have some deliberation with your facilitator table. Can I just again say to our panellists that we've nothing but the utmost admiration for the work, the research that you do, and the services that you provide in this area. And so all of the questions were geared towards how do we strengthen it, how do we replicate it, how do we provide the support to make the required recommendations that help you in everything that you do. But we're really grateful for you giving your time on a Sunday to spend with us, so thank you very much.
Thank you.